even though dosage is made out of sugar, the role of sugar in champagne for me is very much like the way that we use salt in food. You know, we don't always add salt to food to make it salty. And in fact, if a dish is actually noticeably salty, it's probably oversalted.
You're listening to the Vint Podcast, bringing you expert interviews, alternative market insights, and exclusive access to the world of wine and spirits investing. Enjoy the show.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Vint Podcast. My name is Brady, joined in studio by Billy Galanko with a gorgeous background. If you're watching on YouTube, that looks like it could be fake, but I think it's just your back porch, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I guess this is technically the front, but yeah, it's looking out of our bay window that I had told everybody finally got cleared up, so now it's not foggy and it's clear.
Yeah, it's such a nice day there. I bet you're cracking open some champagne tonight, aren't you?
Oh, yeah, well, maybe after re-listening to this podcast, I might. It was definitely made me want some.
Yeah, we're gonna keep it pretty short today. We have a really great guest. I mean, honestly, definitely ranks right up there in terms of notoriety. The guest we have on today for an interview, Peter Liem, world expert in champagne, certainly one of the most respected scholars of individual regions that we have in the wine world. Incredibly accomplished author as well. Wrote this awesome, set book on champagne. I think Billy has his copy here too. We're holding it up if you're watching us on YouTube. Really gorgeous edition. Maps, all the information.
Drawers, yeah,
exactly. Maps, all the information you could hope to know on champagne, and we have a great conversation about both the large champagne houses that everyone maybe knows and the average consumer could rattle off, but also this culture of grower champagne and what that dynamic means if you've never heard that term before.
Yeah, and I love he makes such a complex and intricate region and industry sound so simple. I just love the way he explains it. But one thing I really do like is he wants to bring back focus on champagne as just a wine. It's not just a sparkly beverage you only have for a celebration. It's really a complex wine that is the result of really thoughtful blending, terroir. There's just so much that goes into it, and he's able to articulate that in such a unique way. I found myself reading his book again over just because how interesting the conversation was. So I can't be more excited about the conversation.
Yeah, and I thought that the comparisons that we make in the interview and what he makes and really articulates very well is the comparison between Champagne and Burgundy. Obviously, the two great varieties, Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, that kind of take center stage in both of those regions. That's one commonality. But as Billy said, this focus on terroir as kind of an emerging focus within Champagne, because it's something that we talk about all the time in Burgundy. But Peter, I think, gives us some good insight on how we can think about that more within Champagne. So hope you guys enjoy this interview with Peter Liem.
All right, as we mentioned, we are now here with Peter Liem, Champagne and Sherry extraordinaire. Thank you so much for joining today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, I've been glowing in my emails to Peter ahead of this call. I listened or I read through his book while we were in Jerez, and also been using his champagne book closely. So this is a little bit of a fanboy moment for me. But can you let us know how you how you got into wine in the first place, and then we can work our way down to these wines?
Yeah, I guess, so I've been working with wine for all of my adult life. I suppose I was introduced to wine as a teenager, traveling in Europe. Of course, as a teenage backpacker, you're not exactly drinking the finest wines of the world. But I became, I became very interested in how, even when you're drinking cheap carafe wine, in Italy or Spain or France or whatever, it's always very different wherever you go. Mm-hmm. And so when I got into college, I just started learning more about it and started tasting, started tasting real wines and learning, starting to really learn about interesting wines. Straight out of college, I got a job at a wine store, and that sort of launched my entire wine career. I began, traveling seriously for work and visiting wine regions of the world, and and I guess it sort of snowballed from there.
Nice. Yeah, we always find that people get into it either really young or just from some really random way, and then just
Yeah.
kind of, and it quickly
Fall into it.
escalates.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How did you, so just narrowing it down, I guess, a little bit, how did you end up kind of becoming interested in these process-driven wines, champagne? I mean, you live in Rennes now.
I live in Epernay,
So,
yeah, but I live in the
or
Champagne region.
Epernay, sorry.
When I began my career, of course, I wanted to learn about all the wines of the world, and so I devoted myself to studying everything. Uh, the the area of the wine world that attracted me most was Burgundy,
Hmm.
and this was in the mid '90s, mid to late '90s, and so Burgundy became the sort of thing, or I guess it became like uh, sort of the lens through which I viewed the world of wine. Yeah, it formed it formed kind of the core of my wine philosophy, and and it really influenced the way that I looked at other wines. Um, I first came to Champagne in 1997, and so I I was interested in approaching Champagne in the same way that we do Burgundy. But of course, at the time, this wasn't really a thing.
Mhm.
Uh, at the time, Champagne was still very much a brand-driven thing. It was, most consumers didn't even really think about Champagne as real wine. Um, of course, there were things going on the ground that were very interesting, as I was about to find out. But um, but the culture of Champagne was very different than it is today. And so I came here, and immediately I met some of the best growers in Champagne. Anselm Salos, Pascal Agapar, Jacques Diebolt, Laurent Champ of Villemar. These were all some of the first people that I met in the Champagne region,
Wow.
and it blew my mind. These people, walking the vineyards with them, tasting in their cellars. These were things that you couldn't read in books. That even in magazines, people weren't writing about. People weren't, people in the U.S. weren't talking about this stuff, and and I was amazed. I thought this is a whole new facet of Champagne that I've never seen before, and I wanted to learn more.
Hmm.
So I began coming to Champagne at least once a year, for every year after that, and just tried to taste as much as possible, meet as many people as possible. And so, the late '90s, early 2000s, this was really the sort of time. This was the beginnings of this kind of Champagne evolution that we've seen in in our contemporary time. Uh, I think certainly in the last 25 years, Champagne has changed immensely. It's almost not even the same appellation or the same wine culture as it was back then. Um, but I guess I feel privileged to have kind of witnessed this transformation from almost the beginning, you know, kind of followed the contemporary history of Champagne, or I guess through many changes and for quite a long time period. So that I guess has influenced a lot in what I do about Champagne, and it's influenced a lot, in my writing and even in the way that I approach Champagne today.
What was it that you found as you were walking the vineyards, having these conversations with
fantastic growers, um, being down in the cellars, tasting. Just drill down specifically. What were some things that stood out to you that you knew right away? This, when you say things weren't being talked about, what were some of those things you knew right away this is special?
Well, I suppose one of the biggest things is terroir. So for me, terroir is the most important thing in wine, any wine that I taste. I think, I mean, most of the time, I think wine isn't even really interesting unless it gives you a sense of something about where it comes from. It's I think all great wines in the world will have a story to tell about the place that they were grown. And in sort of this late 20th century model or paradigm of champagne, we would talk about chalk, of course. Champagne is built on this bedrock of chalk, but that's about as far as we would go. Maybe somebody might talk about, the Côte Blanc is different than the Montagne de Reims, and maybe somebody would mention that there are actually different villages in the Côte Blanc. But like Le Mesnil would be a famous village because Salon and Krug are there. Ailly is a famous village because it's been growing wine since medieval times. But in the 90s, nobody was talking about what one village tastes like compared to another, or we were starting to see single vineyard champagnes, but we didn't really know what that meant. We didn't know what makes this vineyard special, and why is that different from the vineyards surrounding it. When I started talking to people like Anselm Salos or Pascal Agripar, and seeing this other vision of Champagne and seeing how they were approaching their vineyards, in basically the same way that all the great growers of Burgundy were, and talking about different soil types, talking about different parcels, making wine actually from different parcels. This, I thought, wow, this is something completely revolutionary, or in my mind, and it's something that I wanted to explore.
And Peter, do you think that some of what you described, when you talk about some of this focus on terroir and the comparisons to Burgundy, the fact that Salas was talking about this with you, you said that this wasn't a conversation that you were hearing when you were in the States, right? This wasn't a conversation that people were having in Champagne. Were big monolithic producers and large houses, were they, most of the conversation was what you experienced happening in those spaces, or was it not at all? Was it really just among these groups?
You would get it. It depends on who you talk to. And what I found was that for most of the houses that I visited, if you wanted to, they would be a little surprised, if we're talking like 1996 or 1998, like. Mm-hmm. If you wanted to talk to a chef de cave about the terroir of Champagne, they would be a little surprised, but they would be happy to do it. But they would talk about it in very general terms. They might, of course, they would separate different villages. So, like, you might have a tank of Ailly Pinot Noir and a tank of Cumières Pinot Noir, a tank of Verzenay Pinot Noir, but it didn't go farther than that. There were some houses that were beginning to, just to like really push the envelope. People like Louis Roederer, like Krug, they've always been a little bit more precise in what they've done, and other houses, to varying degrees. But in general, the conversations weren't really going in that direction. It's not that. I don't really believe this narrative that it's avant-garde growers that sort of like, were the locomotive of Champagne, and and all the houses were industrial and stuck in the past and whatever. I mean, this is just not true. But but I guess in conversations that I had, and I guess, sort of the overall narrative, at that time period, I was learning, I guess I was learning more from grower producers.
So, have you seen any changes in style or quality, or I guess terroir discussions as the United States or as the market as a whole has been, recognizing these growers, even though they're not coming into existence, but it's becoming more regularly talked about? Is that impacting anything on the ground, or is it just more everybody here trying to understand it more?
Yeah, I think as the appellation evolved, I think it went both ways, because I and other like-minded wine professionals, we would come to the region and we would start asking questions that maybe normal visitors of Champagne weren't asking, because we were really treating Champagne as a real wine, and so we would ask the same questions of Champagne as we would any other wine. Questions about viticulture, questions about sustainability, about terroir expression, about all sorts of things. And so 25 years ago, maybe producers, growers or houses, it doesn't matter, but maybe producers were not always prepared to answer these questions, because maybe they hadn't figured it out for themselves yet. So yeah, people were changing here, but probably as the consumer vision of Champagne began to change, that probably had an influence as well. Yeah, it's it's a little chicken and egg.
Can you just, for our listeners, kind of, I know we didn't want to get too much in the 101, but just differentiate a little bit between like the bigger house model and the grower Champagne model, I guess, just to clarify exactly kind of what we're talking about, and then maybe some that fall in between, like you were saying, like
Sure.
Rotaries of the world.
So historically, it's said, it's not exactly true, but it's said historically that vine growers grow the grapes, they sell the grapes to negociants, houses, and the houses make the wine. This is kind of the simplified narrative. The areas where that breaks down is that most negociant houses have always owned a great deal of vineyards. So they have vineyards of their own, as well as purchasing grapes from growers. And then a lot of grower producers make their own wine in addition to selling grapes. And eventually, like, a lot of grower producers would just stop selling grapes and just make their own wine. Of course, in terms of scale, this would usually be very different, right? A grower producer might make, anywhere between 30,000 and 100,000 bottles a year. A house might be making 1 million or more. Yeah. So, especially when grower producers began to be imported into the United States and other countries, began to have more of a presence in the export market. This was around like the early 2000s. There was this sort of selling tactic of pitting small growers versus big houses, with the implication that smaller is better and bigger is industrial, and then this was something that I never liked. I think that it's not a useful way of looking at Champagne, and a lot of those implications just aren't true. A lot of the implications in terms of quality aren't true. In terms of style, yes, if you're making 1 million bottles a year, you're going to make a different style of wine than if you're making 20,000 bottles a year. But that doesn't really have intrinsic implications of quality. So I think, and we've seen that too as time has moved on, even in terms of things like high quality viticulture, or in terms of sustainability, or these things that we think are kind of avant-garde and contemporary. It's not always the growers that are at the forefront. It's houses have every bit as much of a role to play. In what I do in my writing, in like things like La Fête du Champagne, the event that I put on with Jonas, I have always avoided this kind of grower versus house mentality. I'm interested in good champagne versus mediocre champagne, and good champagne can come from producers of all sizes and of all types, and that's what's interesting.
Adam, our director of wine, had an interesting question. I told him we were going to be speaking with you, and he was like, "Can you ask them a little bit about the rise in seemingly increasing in critical attention towards some of these like luxury, maybe the more expensive growers, whereas before they used to really focus on the Doms of the world, Dom Perignons and stuff like that. How is that changing kind of the people's perception of champagne? And do you think it's maybe impacted by something like Burgundy, where it's like Burgundy skyrocketed, people are like, oh, this is small production, it's expensive. Maybe people want to hear about these champagnes that they didn't before, and now they're rating them.
Yeah, I think that's kind of exactly it. It's been alarming. It's only been the last few years. It's that we've seen this kind of explosion in pricing for the top grower champagnes. In the past at auction, even up till just a little while ago, the only champagnes that would really sell at auction would be, Dom Perignon, Krug, Cristal, Salon. And now you're seeing prices for like Salos and Jérôme Prévost and these things like start to escalate. And I think that's really you can draw a lot of parallels with Burgundy. About people looking for the same types of wines. These kind of really small production, high quality, really distinctive wines that they're basically willing to pay any amount of money for. So that's bad news for the rest of us. But yeah, this is a very recent phenomenon with champagne, and it's only going to escalate.
I think that you kind of keep coming back to the comparison between Champagne and Burgundy. Is there anything other than what is it inherent about the region of Champagne that makes it apt to compare it to Burgundy? I think maybe sometimes people think, well, isn't it all just like pretty monolithic? It's all just chalk, right? What makes it? What are a couple of the specific things that make it apt to compare to Burgundy?
Yeah, I guess there are things that are similar and things that aren't. I guess to begin with, we use the same grape varieties, so that's a start. Champagne and Burgundy have been sort of linked together ever since the Middle Ages, really. They were wine regions that were next to each other. Politically, they were sometimes rivals. Their wines, were two of the most famous in this section of Europe. I guess Burgundy being much farther south, they were able to focus on still wines. Champagne really gravitated towards sparkling wines out of necessity, just because of climate, ripening, and all that. But I think that the idea of terroir expression and like this attention to detail in kind of specificity of place. This is something that we associate with Burgundy, but Burgundy certainly doesn't have a monopoly on it, right? We can find terroir-driven wines from basically all great wine regions of the world. And so so Champagne is no exception. I think that Champagne's terroir is much more diverse than most people think that it is. Most people think that it's just chalk, and actually, there's a lot more going on in Champagne. But at the same time, Champagne isn't Burgundy. I think that well, I guess a lot of people ask me, do you think that the future of Champagne is really, to make all these single vineyard wines, and that will that the appellation will eventually resemble Burgundy more in that way? And I don't think so, because I think that even with the diversity of terroir in Champagne, you can see that most parcels, most lieux-dits, don't really make a complete wine. And they can be good blending components, but there are actually very few parcels, comparatively few parcels, that really make a complete wine on their own. So I think single vineyard Champagne is great, and there are a lot of really successful ones and a lot of really interesting ones. But blending is very much part of the culture of Champagne for a reason, and most often, blended wine is just better here.
Yeah, for sure. Can you give our listeners like a quick overview of, I guess, the different regions and kind of their unique characteristics, and maybe like the primary grape that's grown there, even though most of them are mixed?
Yeah, so the Champagne appellation is a big place. It covers 34,000 hectares. I was just down in the very south of Champagne earlier this week. To drive from my house down to there takes like at least 2 hours. So it's, even when you're going by the autoroute, so geographically it covers a large area, and so as you would expect, there's a lot of diversity, within there. Historically, we've sort of divided Champagne into 4 main subregions. There is the Montagne de France, which is around this plateau between the cities of Reims and Epernay. So this is the northern part of Champagne. There is the Vallée de la Marne, which is the area along the river, along the Marne River, which is the major river that runs through Champagne. Then there's the Côte de Blanc, which is a sort of, it's not really a hill. It's this kind of cliff, or there's like, not a cliff, but like an escarpment that runs south of the city of Epernay, and that's really famous for its Chardonnay. And then there's the area in the very south of Champagne, in the department of the Aube, which is called the Côte des Bar. So, most wine books, will mention these 4 areas. For me, that's still a little bit general and a little bit simplistic. Champagne is more diverse than that. The CIVC, the governing body of Champagne, they have this wonderful map that divides Champagne up into 20 different subregions. So it gets, pretty granular. And I think that's wonderful. I think maybe that's a little bit too granular for the average consumer, So in my book, I settled on 7 different subregions. I kind of divided up the Vallée de la Marne, especially. I divided it up into 3. I included a couple other subregions south of the Côte de Blanc. There's the Cézanne. There's the Cézanne and this area called the Côte de Morane, or Côte du Petit Morane. And then there's a new area called the Vitriat, which is kind of to the east. But I think, these areas are important, and they, shouldn't really be lumped into the others. But again, this is like, it can quickly get a little bit technical.
Yeah. Oh, that makes a lot of sense. And those generalizations, I think it does help. Like, I think people can kind of take them like steps. They can start with the 4, and then they can dive a little bit further, and then they can go. I was in a sparkling focused tasting in San Luis Obispo, which is kind of a small town. So, but she gave me a champagne flight last week, and one of them was primarily Meunier, and I was like, oh, like where does the fruit come from? Is it mostly the Valley de Marne? And then she was like, no, this is made in Epernay. The grapes come from Epernay. And I was like,
Yeah.
are you sure? And she's like, no, I was like, yeah, that was kind of interesting. But so something else I've heard you speak about before, and I would love to dive into, along with blending and creating a complete wine with grapes from different regions and different grapes. Can you talk about the role of dosage and why the idea of zero dosage is a style, like not as an approach, is just kind of weird and not helpful?
Yeah, I think dosage is the single most misunderstood element, of champagne, and not only by consumers but by professionals, even by winemakers. I think even a lot of people in Champagne don't really understand dosage properly. We think that, well, I guess because of sugar, because dosage is sugar, it's tempting to think that that it's just there to add sweetness, right? So if you like sweet champagnes or if you like sweet wines, then you add a little bit more. But like I don't eat a lot of sugar. I don't really, I like dry wines. So then it's tempting to think of the idea of adding sugar as bad, and so non-dosé champagne or a zero dosage champagne would just be intrinsically better. And the thing is, it doesn't work like that at all. Even though dosage is made out of sugar, the role of sugar in champagne for me is very much like the way that we use salt in food. Mm-hmm. We don't always add salt to food to make it salty. And in fact, if a dish is actually noticeably salty, it's probably oversalted. But at the same time, if we have a dish with too little salt, that's readily evident as well. And so salt in food, it provides harmony, but it also expands the other flavors, right? It expands other elements in a dish. And so salt works in a very complex way, as sort of this flavor enhancer. And the thing is, dosage works exactly the same way in champagne. Like you'll hear, like sometimes you'll hear winemakers say, well, I don't put dosage in my wine because I really want the terroir to be expressed. I want the terroir to show through. So, my non-dosé is like super minerally and super terroir expressive. And the thing is, you taste it, and it's actually not more terroir expressive. It's actually less. Because a wine that's properly dosed, it enhances everything. It brings out complexity of flavor, but it brings out, part of that complexity of flavor is actually expression of terroir. Making a wine more complete brings out all these elements within the wine itself. And so, I always think that, so every wine is different, of course. And this is another problem, is that because dosage is referred to in terms of numbers, it gets very hazardous. So it's tempting to think, well, 7 grams of dosage, that sounds so high, I would never drink that. I prefer 3. But it's like saying, like, I'll only eat a dish that has 50 milligrams of salt in it. It's meaningless if you don't have a context. So I think for me, it's the job of a winemaker to figure out what is the level of dosage that this wine needs. And every wine is different. It might need 3 grams. It might need 7 grams. It might even need 10 grams. It might need 0. It might not need any at all. But you won't know until you actually taste that wine and you actually experiment with that particular wine. So all of the best producers, they do dosage trials. So where they'll take a wine and dose it at various levels. So it depends, like some people might do like 0 all the way up to 10. Some people might do like 0 up to 5 because they know that, in the past their wine just hasn't been successful over 5 or whatever. It doesn't, the numbers themselves don't really matter. I think what matters is this spirit of, or I guess this intent of wanting to find the proper dosage for that specific wine. And these dosage trials are really fascinating. When you taste, oftentimes when you taste the same wine at different dosage levels, it's not at all a linear progression. You would think like, well, a wine that's dosed at 2 grams is necessarily going to taste drier than a wine at 4 grams. But you can really easily get confused in these dosage tastings because sugar just doesn't really work that way in champagne. I always find that when a champagne is dosed absolutely perfectly, the sugar disappears. It like disappears into the fabric of the wine, and it just becomes integrated into the whole. So I've actually had plenty of experiences where I thought, let's say I thought the perfect dosage was 5 grams per liter, for this particular wine. I would taste that 5 gram dosage. It would taste completely dry. The wine tastes harmonious, complete, whatever. And you taste it at 3 grams, and instead of tasting drier, the sugar actually would stick out more. And so you would feel a greater perception of sweetness, actually, because it was improperly dosed. So dosage is a really tricky thing, and it's kind of a pitfall, when you're learning about champagne. And now I find that a lot of producers and even a lot of like importers or like people who are selling wine have just stopped talking about dosage because it's not really important. It's certainly not the most important thing about the wine. It's like asking a chef, how much salt did you put in this dish? I don't care. That's far from the most important thing about the dish.
Really interesting. I've heard you say a couple of things now. Sort of talking about what's people's perception or misperception. First, you said, people tend to think that the terroir of Champagne is all chalk, and that's not the case. And it's like, oh, there's this misunderstanding about dosage, and we haven't even discussed the fact that everyone calls all sparkling wine here in the West champagne. So what are, if you could maybe 3 to 5 things that if just a listener picked up the podcast and they were getting a quick hit on champagne, what are like 3 to 5 things that you wish that they understood or knew freshly about champagne?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess to begin with, it sounds like super basic, but yeah, when the Champenois say champagne only comes from Champagne, I mean, this is true. Champagne is not the name of a style of wine. It's the name of a specific wine from a specific place. So Champagne is a sparkling wine that comes from the Champagne region of France. This isn't to say that there aren't plenty of good sparkling wines being made elsewhere. They're just not called Champagne. So when you say champagne, that refers to a very specific wine. And then, talking about diversity, I think champagne today, stylistically, champagne is more diverse than ever before. And that makes it really exciting. I think there's so many different types and styles and profiles of champagne that sometimes it's hard to believe that all of these things come from the same appellation. And so there's going to be a champagne for everybody. It's you might taste some champagnes and not really be into them, and you might think, well, I don't like champagne. But champagne is so diverse that I guarantee you that I could find something that you would really gravitate towards. I guess because of that too, I think diversity of champagne is greater than ever before. The median quality in champagne certainly is greater than it's higher than ever before in human history. And so I think that right now is one of the greatest times, in history to buy champagne and to drink champagne. We've seen this, of course, in the consumer market. More and more people have begun to pursue champagne in a very serious way. Treating champagne as a real wine and as a wine like any other, and that's interesting.
One random question that I've had in my mind for years is what exactly is the special club bottlings or special club wines, and how does that vary from, like, say, a tête de cuvée that people normally make?
Yeah, so special club is it's a growers association, right? So it's a group of wine growers. It was started in 1971. At that time, it was called the Club des Viticulteurs. Today, it's called the Club des Trésors. But so their idea, in the early 70s, grower producers they often struggled to sell their wine because the region was really dominated by a handful of brands. And so, just as a sort of marketing aid, they formed an association together, sort of under a charter of quality. They wanted to demonstrate that they were making wines of very high quality, and so they decided each of them would make a cuvée, which they called the special club, that would represent their tête de cuvée, basically. So it would be the special club wine was intended to be the best wine of the cellar, and really be of prestige cuvée quality. And so to ensure that, they established this system of pretty rigorous tasting. So not only tasting among themselves, but also bringing in a panel of like enologists and having sort of external confirmation as well. But so each special club wine gets tasted twice, and it has to pass both of these tests before being approved for being released, under the label special club. And so they created a special bottle that's unique to the club. Originally, they had a special label that was also unique to the club. They've since relaxed that requirement. But so the club, has evolved over the years. I mean, it's been 50 years now. But it's still going strong. There are, I don't remember how many growers. There are like 20-something growers, in the club. Some very, very good ones, and they still continue to make this cuvée, or each of the producers continue to make a cuvée called Special Club. So their intent is that if you buy a champagne labeled as Special Club, they will all be different in character according to the individual growers, but they'll be at a certain standard of quality. It's really intended to be a prestige cuvée, a tête de cuvée.
Cool. No, that makes sense. Like I've gathered it in your book. I think right after I got your champagne book, I went out and got one, and I love the bottle shape. Like it's just so cool. It does feel special. So that's fun. Yeah. Well, one topic. I'm kind of sad because I wanted to talk to you about sherry because it's also near and dear to my heart, but I don't think we're going to get there. So we'll have to have you back on because that's a whole nother podcast. But sustainability in champagne, I think when people think of, especially when you start hearing million bottles and this larger scale production, they don't think about sustainability. But champagne, number one, their climate is going to be most directly impacted. These slight variations going from cool to warmer. Two, there's a larger, like the comité or the CIVC, like you were talking about, it's really being led from like a really broad level. Can you talk about like some of the efforts outside of just individual producers?
Yeah. So, I mean, I could be biased and a little partisan because I work with Champagne, but I'm a critic, so it's my job to be objective. But I'm actually really impressed by what Champagne has done, and as an appellation, I think um, Champagne is often criticized for its viticulture, and it's easy as an outsider to look at Champagne historically and say well, this is a seriously underachieving area, and it's also it's also tempting to believe in this narrative of it's only the avant-garde growers who are doing anything high quality in the vineyards. The rest of Champagne is all like industrial and whatever. But actually, none of this is true. The CIVC has made enormous strides or they've had initiatives that have produced enormous impacts in the Champagne region over the last 20 years. They have addressed all sorts of things, not just viticulture, trying to reduce herbicides, reduce pesticides, but also looking at things like waste recycling, like recycling of water, overall carbon footprint, looking at sustainability from more of a global view and not just efforts in the vineyards. And so this has been really encouraging, in fact. And on their website, you can read all about all of these specific initiatives that they've done. And so, of course, Champagne is a big place, right? There are, I guess, 400 houses now, and about 16,000 growers. So to get everybody to agree, or to get everybody to rise to to get everybody to raise their level of quality, of course, this is going to be a major battle. And you're always going to be hampered by the lowest common denominator. There's always going to be growers who are like, you can't tell me what to do. I've been growing vines since you were in diapers, and I know what I'm doing. But even so, I think that they've even for the reluctant ones, the CIVC has sort of subtly forced them to come along and to get with the program. It's not that everybody is organic and biodynamic, and that's not even the goal. But the goal is to increase sustainability, increase environmental protection, decrease carbon footprint, just make Champagne a more sustainable appellation. And in fact, it's hard to think of another wine region that has had such a concerted overall effort, that's being driven from the top, really. So that's been actually very encouraging.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think the only other country that, in my mind, is kind of a region that, like, New Zealand has a very high level of sustainability, but to your point, that's not driven by a single organization that's getting people on board. So, yeah. Brady here. Sorry, I don't want to cut you off there. Just had to add that.
I just wanted to maybe move into talking about some of your projects, and obviously we mentioned your gorgeous book.
Thank you.
In passing in the conversation so far, how did that project come about, and did that kind of feel like a magnum opus? Like, what? Tell us about that project, how it came about, and sort of what the goal is there. Obviously, you've already said that you had to kind of narrow the focus and pare back all that you could have put in there, but it's still an impressive volume.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I guess I had a book in my head, for a long time, and I didn't really know how to approach it or or I didn't really have a very clear vision of what it was going to be. I was learning a lot about Champagne and collecting a lot of data, but I didn't really know how to sort of focus that. So I ended up starting this website, champagneguide.net, in 2009, and kind of doing that instead of writing a book, because it was this sort of platform to talk about a lot of different things in Champagne. And so I could do producer profiles, I could do like wine tasting notes, but I could also write long form articles. I could talk about a lot of different topics in Champagne, and it didn't require the sort of precise organization of a book. And it wasn't until later on that it was my book agent, actually, who helped me a lot. She was really encouraging me to to write a book on Champagne, and we talked a lot about what format, what kind of what the book would look like, what format it would take. And I knew that I wanted to talk about contemporary Champagne. I think I think about Champagne as sort of having gone through these eras and these kind of paradigm shifts, where when I started, when I entered the wine trade, Champagne was very much in this late 20th century mentality. That had sort of started around the industrialization of the 70s and was continuing all the way up into the 2000s, And I think that really, for all of us, all of us, I guess, of wine drinking age, I guess there are people who started drinking wine before that time, but for most of us, we all kind of grew up in this sort of Champagne paradigm, where Champagne was driven by a handful of famous brands. We talked about Champagne as really a wine of process, focusing on its winemaking, focusing on things like lees aging and second fermentation, and believing in things like the base wines of Champagne are really neutral, and then what really gives Champagne its character is these processes, this process, the Champagne method that takes place in cellars, and all of this stuff, and that really persisted, well into the 2000s, and there were a lot of Champagne books written during this time, but I kind of felt like they were all still talking about Champagne from this perspective, from this late 20th century perspective. And I wanted to do something new, something different. I wanted to move the conversation in a different direction. And so, I knew that I wanted to talk a lot about the terroir of Champagne, because that's how I approach, any wine. And there was a lot to say as well. We're still exploring the terroir of Champagne. I don't think that we know it as definitively as we do Burgundy, for sure, or even like, places like Barolo, or or Bordeaux even. We haven't, or I guess we're still in the process of writing the story of Champagne terroir, or discovering. So my goal wasn't really to write like the definitive book, because you can't, it wasn't possible. But I wanted to at least initiate the conversation. I wanted to establish a foundation that that we could then build on, and a platform from which then we can really talk about Champagne and terroir in an intelligent and in-depth way. And so, a big influence for me as a wine student were these maps of Louis Larmant, that were created in the 1940s. They were the most detailed vineyard maps, that had been created in Champagne, or that had been publicly released, at least published. And there hasn't really been anything like that, or even though these things were from the 1940s, nobody had ever really initiated a project like that afterwards, until now. So now, my friend Charles Curtis is working on a project doing sort of the same thing with contemporary maps of Champagne, which is really exciting. And I encourage everybody to go seek out those maps. But at this time, at the time that I was writing my book, the Larmant maps were the most detailed that were available. But the thing is that these Larmant maps were they're very rare to get original copies. It's very expensive, and you just have to be lucky to find them at auction or whatever. So I wanted to make these available. Most people had never seen these, and I wanted to put them in more people's hands. So I knew I wanted to include them in my book for in some way. And it turned out really well, because my book discusses the terroir of Champagne in a very detailed way. You really need maps to accompany it, otherwise you don't really know what's going on. And so I wanted to include these maps, and it was actually my publisher, it was actually the designer at my publisher, 10-Speed Press, who came up with this brilliant idea of this slipcase that includes the maps in one of the drawers. And so I was really happy with the way that turned out. I thought that was a really effective way of showcasing these maps and complementing the book.
Yeah, on the note of the maps. Oh, sorry, Brady. Just one note on the maps. I live in a small one-bedroom apartment here in Los Angeles, but eventually, because my girlfriend won't let me put them up, but I'm gonna frame one, and they will be on a wall someday. But they are that good looking.
Yeah, they are.
So Champagne Guide came first, then there's the book. How has Champagne Guide evolved since then, and what's kind of how do most folks use the site, and how are you using the site in terms of what information you're most excited about putting out there?
So right now, to be honest, it's undergoing a bit of transformation or transition. The way that I had set it up was very much as a vehicle of wine criticism. So the heart of the site is producer profiles with attached tasting notes, that I would try and update every year. I would also write articles, but I think the focus of the site was really these producer profiles, and I think that was great at the time. But today in 2023, I think that there are different things that we can do to talk about wine and talk about Champagne, and so I would like to move it into more of an educational platform. What that's going to look like in the future, I'm not entirely sure, but I've been very influenced by, a big part of what I do, besides being a writer, is Champagne education. So I put on an event in New York, called La Fête du Champagne, but also, I do Champagne seminars and tastings and events in other places around the world. And so I guess just talking to people about Champagne, seeing their enthusiasm, and also seeing how eager people are to learn about Champagne, and that's encouraging. And then I guess also figuring out how to transmit that information, or to transmit all these details about Champagne. I guess I've learned a lot, in the process, and so I guess I would just like to make that become more of an intrinsic part of the site.
Yeah, so I think it's such an extensive guide, and I think a really valuable resource, or valuable in terms of super accessible, believe, the subscription price is really low for what you get on the site. So yeah, it's a great resource for anyone out there. And I think it's a great compliment, obviously, to the book, because you have such an awesome visual guide, and the maps and everything, with, extensive backlog on the site as well. And vintage ratings going back to 95, which is awesome. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Billy, I don't know, did you have a direction you wanted to go here? I was going to try and get some personal thoughts about the year ahead and wines that Peter's into right now before we tie it up.
Yeah, no, go ahead. I will also ask you what you're drinking outside of champagne. I guess, Brady, you can throw that in there, but
yeah,
I don't want
to. That's what I was going to. Well, yeah, I didn't want to steer too far out of champagne, unless we got to sherry, but it looks like we're scrapping sherry. So I was curious, is like, of the other regions where we think about sparkling wine coming from, what do you drink the most of? Have you spent much time in Sussex in the UK to check out, the English sparkling? You drink a lot of Cava or Prosecco. What sort of things are you into?
Yeah, I guess I'm always interested in tasting other sparkling wines of the world. I don't write about them, and I rarely get a chance to visit. So, like England, for example, I haven't visited a lot of producers, but I've tasted a fair amount of wine, and some of it I think is very promising. But I think, today there's been so much serious effort, put into making sparkling wine around the world, that you can find really excellent sparkling wine almost anywhere. Not that you can find terrible sparkling wine in a lot of places as well, but I think there are a lot of producers around the world doing really interesting things. So yeah, I always try and taste wherever I can. I've found great sparkling wines in like all sorts of corners of the world. Certainly famous ones like Franciacorta, or the Penedès, or like California, Australia, Tasmania, certainly. But then even places like Austria and Germany, and there's tons of great sparkling wine being made.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I think Tasmania is my favorite outside of Champagne, but that's just because I got to go drive around and dive deep. I don't think they have enough access outside of there. When you're drinking still wines, I know I had listened, I think, to one of your previous podcasts where I think you were in New York, probably for the Fête or something, and you were like, we can't get many Italian wines or other wines when I'm in France. So are you an Italian wine fan, or like what's your other favorites when it comes?
Yeah, I love. I guess I love all sorts of wines with distinction. It's like if a wine has something to say and expresses it's the place where it's grown and does it in an articulate manner, then I'm interested. I guess as far as personal preference, I prefer, or I guess I'm sensitive to alcohol, so I would prefer wines of lower alcohol than higher. I prefer wines of higher acidity. So I tend to drink more from northern parts of Europe than I do southern. But then there are always exceptions. Like, I love wines from all over Italy. My favorite is my favorite is definitely Piedmont. I love Nebbiolo, all areas of Piedmont, really. But I love wines from up and down Italy. I think that there's such an incredible diversity of grape varieties and terroirs, and there's so many interesting things. Spain as well. Spain, a lot of areas of Spain, can be really hot, and so, maybe those aren't the wines that I think that I would be attracted to. But then sometimes you taste these things, and from all corners of Spain that are really exciting. having said that, probably my favorite wine in Spain is really traditional Rioja. That's, again, low in alcohol and really age-worthy and has a fair bit of acidity. But yeah, I tend to drink wines, from all over Europe. Here in Europe, we don't have much access to wines from other places. So when I'm in the United States, I try and taste whatever American wines that I can. And certainly when I travel, I'm always interested in. But yeah, I try and keep it open mind.
Nice. Yeah. Billy, do you have anything else?
No, that's perfect. I realize we're running over, but I could just listen for hours. Yeah.
Well, Peter, thanks for joining us. We'll definitely have to do that Sherry episode at some point, if you'll have us back, or if you'll have yourself back, I guess. We'll definitely have you. We appreciate your time. We appreciate all the work that you put into expanding the access to knowledge of this region. So thanks a lot for sharing with our listeners.
Yeah, thank you very much.
All right, that was our interview with Peter Liem. I hope everybody really enjoyed learning about the Champagne. I think you probably have a better understanding now of the intricacy of the regions and all the nuance that can come from Champagne and not just a bottle of bubbles. So everybody go find some Champagne this weekend, and we'll be back with another episode next week. Cheers.
To check out our current offerings and to sign up for the Vint platform, find us at www.vint.co. That's www.vint.co. For questions, comments, or feedback on the Vint podcast, please email us at support@vint.co. Vint and VV Markets are offering securities pursuant to Regulation A. Our offering circular as amended can be found on the SEC website. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. Investments such as those on the Vint platform are speculative and involve substantial risks to consider before investing. We may provide communication that may contain certain forward-looking statements that are subject to various risks and uncertainties. Information provided in any communications, including this podcast, is not legal, business, or tax advice. All prospective investors should consult a legal, tax, or business advisor concerning the subject matter of any communications and any offering.